scientist at the Food Environment Consumer Behavior here at the Alliance in Colombia, and we are here with my colleague Jane Battersby, who is an amazing scientist and a geographer based in University of Cape Town in South Africa. She's an associate professor there, and she's visiting us mostly to give her insights on the HLP report, which stands for High Level Panel of Experts on. It's a global report that's gathering all the evidence on urban peri-urban systems. She was also part of the previous year's HLP report on inequalities in food and nutrition outcomes. And Jane will be running the Kali Marathon, so we will all be cheering her on as she runs it. So Jane, we're super thrilled to have you here. Thank you for coming all the way from South Africa. I know that was not easy. We have some questions to ask you to share your insights on this process and your experience working with the urban and peri-urban. Could you please explain to an intelligent 12-year-old like your son what is urban and peri-urban food systems and why we should care?
Yeah. So the idea of urban and peri-urban food systems is a bit complicated. So first off, it's about the food that happens within the cities and urban areas and peri-urban areas. So it's the things, the consumption within the city, it's the kind of food system activities that happen in cities. So retailing, processing, logistics, all those kinds of things. So first it's food in the city, but then it's also food for the city. So it's the idea that food consumed in cities doesn't necessarily come from within the city or even from the areas directly around the city. So the urban and peri-urban food system is both the stuff that happens in the city, but the kinds of foods that come into the city from beyond. So it's food in the city, food for the city, but I think the other component, which is something that we raised in the report for the first time, is really thinking about food and the city. And so what is it about an urban area that shapes a food system? So things like transport, things like the quality of infrastructure, all of those things shape the food system. So if you think about a market and poor access to water, that is going to fundamentally shape the food safety, the kinds of foods that vendors are selling. So there's this interaction between the food system and the urban system.
It's really great. How is it in theory, how people do that, versus what is it in the reality, the urban food systems?
It's a really interesting question, because I think in urban and peri-urban systems, we actually don't often see the food system. Mm-hmm. It's everywhere, mm-hmm. but it's not really something that local governments in particular have really been aware of. Mm-hmm. So the amount of jobs in cities that come from the food system mm-hmm. is massive, mm-hmm. but they're not really always calculated. The amount of waste in our systems that's generated from food is massive, but it's not always seen. So I think what we have is this idea of a food system that's often based on the productive side of things and not all the things that happen within the city. So I think that the kind of invisibility of those urban food systems makes it something that hasn't really had that much policy and governance attention.
Yeah, I'm very interested in where food waste goes from, especially, I mean, I don't know, I'm new to Kali, but I'm curious if people have mapped that out, where the food waste and foods from food systems go in the city urban systems. That's great. Can you share some key data or facts to help the audience understand why this framing is important?
Yeah. So this is a really important framing. I mean, I work on the urban, so I'm going to say it's important. Mm-hmm. But some of the key facts and figures are globally about 80% of food that's consumed, 80 to 80% of food that's consumed is consumed in urban areas. Mm-hmm. So the urban areas are big drivers of demand, and they're shaping wider food systems. Mm-hmm. So that's the first point. Mm-hmm. The other one is that there's always been this imagining that the problem of food insecurity is really a rural problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yet in the HLPU report, as you know, we took the numbers rather than the proportions and found that globally 3/4 of the world's population struggling with food insecurity live in urban and peri-urban areas. And to me, that demands a very different sense of policy responses. The other issue is that urbanization is not going away. No. And so we're seeing continued urbanization, and there's going to be a continuation of that process. Increasingly, we're seeing that urbanization isn't driven by rural to urban migration, it's natural population growth within cities. So although, there are some people who think that we we can reverse this tide of urbanization. I think it's inevitable, and we need to be responding to the reality that we have.
And how is that different? And I just want to pick up on that point, what you said about population growth versus rural to migration related urbanization. How is that different in the context you're coming from the Southern African, East African context? And if you have any insights to share on Latin America.
Yeah, so in Latin America, your urban transition took place much earlier. The urban transition in Africa is still ongoing, and the bulk of the new urban population is going to be African. I think as we see it becoming less connected with migration, we're going to see a change in the nature of urban-rural linkages. And so we still see people remitting and receiving. I think as time goes on, that those net connections may be fractured. And so we need to think about what does it mean when you have an urban population that no longer has a firm link to the rural. And when those kind of links to traditional diets are more and more broken, what does that mean for the food system? So I think there's some big questions about how the nature of urbanization and urban populations are going to change food demand, change the kinds of markets, change the kinds of networks that are operating.
That's really great. I didn't even think about the distance from the traditional food culture. Great point. For the Alliance, why should an organization like the Alliance, which has a mandate related to agriculture, look at urban, peri-urban food systems? How do we connect what we traditionally perceive as rural?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think simply the reality of the weight of numbers and where the challenge around food security is should prompt some change in thinking. I think also, again, we've had this conversation about the power of cities to change food systems. And yet we know that local governments often don't feel they have a lot of power. And people themselves, particularly food insecure people, don't have the power to change their kind of purchasing consumption patterns. And yet it is from within these urban areas that a lot of the food transformation is happening. And so there has to be some way of thinking about how do we shape the demand within cities, because that is changing the demand in terms of production. And assuming that if we change production system, it will change consumption is not happening. And so I think there's going to be a need to connect those dots along the way. And that's not saying the Alliance needs to have a strong urban focus, but I think it needs to be aware of those drivers and potentially who you need to connect to have those points of intervention to start to change the demand to meet the changing supply.
Can you give us an example of this food system transformation that you were saying that's taking place in cities?
Sure. So the transformation we're seeing in cities, there's a kind of increased global diet. There's an increased consumption of highly processed foods. And that highly processed food consumption is being driven by some of the changes in cities. So we know people have incredibly long commuting times, particularly poor populations. That means that you get home after 3 hours of traveling, you don't have the time or the energy to cook a slow-cooked meal of rice and beans. You don't have the energy costs make it difficult. All those things are the urban lifestyle, the urban design is forcing diets to shift. And the food system is adapting to those in ways that are not good for health and nutrition. And so how do we unlock those systems of change? And so, if it's around trying to shift people to eating more healthy, nutritious foods, those things have got to be available in the markets, they've got to be accessible, and there's got to be some way to counter some of those urban challenges. And so thinking creatively around what kinds of solutions. So is it about making sure that public procurement is enabling better access to healthier foods for children and connecting to those rural markets? Is it about thinking about places where people naturally congregate and aggregate? So places like bus stations, taxi ranks, and crowding in healthy meals there as another way of shifting that. So it's working with understanding what the system is doing and then finding ways to intervene and how that has these kind of positive outcomes back upstream again.
I would love to have affordable, accessible, healthy cooked meal at the end of the day.
Yeah, me too.
It's just like a lot of women work outside the home, and it's not just men. So it becomes such a huge load. You mentioned the power of the governments, so just tying back to that a bit. What would you say would be the main interests of local governments when they want to approach tangible changes in the food systems?
Yeah. So one of the things we've been doing is trying to demonstrate to local governments that they do actually have quite a few powers to change the food system. You know, so they might not have power to change the kind of rural dynamics, but so many of those food system activities in the cities are shaped by what cities are already doing.
Sure.
So urban spatial planning, an easy entry point. Some of that is saying, well, you know, think about where you need to have markets located, what kinds of infrastructure, because infrastructure is largely local government. What kinds of things do you need to put in place to enable those sales of healthy food? But then you maybe apply a food sensitive planning lens and saying, okay, so if you are developing new housing, what kinds of resources need to be put in those houses that make it possible for people to safely store and cook food? Where do these things need to be? So there's all of that. And then it's saying, well, where government has its limitations, who else do they need to partner with? And thinking about these kind of multi-actor platforms when you can get the retailer associations on board and part of those conversations. So it's kind of broadening the scope of what we think about as food systems governance.
No, this is great. Thank you so much. And then last question, how important is it to be able to see and understand the role of invisible actors in urban food systems? Perhaps you can take an example that you recently talked about, and what are the benefits and not so much like the harmful effects of it.
Yeah. So there's two forms of invisible actors, I think. I think there's the first one is that a lot of the changes in the food system are as a result of non-food system decisions. So one of the things we're seeing in our context is this rapid expansion of the supermarket sector. And when local government provide planning permission for a new shopping mall that always has a supermarket, the decision is not about food, it's about employment, around capital development, around local economic development, around taxes, all of those things come in. And so in some ways, the developers are the invisible actors in the food system there, and they have an incredibly powerful voice when speaking to government because they understand the language of what government wants. So job creation.
Yes.
But actually when the supermarket comes in, it puts out of business a lot of small-scale actors. So you've kind of got job creation and loss of jobs at the same time, but those voices are never through. So that's the first set of invisible actors. The other set of invisible actors are the actors who need to, or often want to, remain invisible to the state. So the informal sector actors don't want to be too visible to the state because they're contravening planning codes. They're not able to meet some of the high-level food safety coding. And so they will try to remain off the government's kind of line of sight. But these are absolutely critical to the food security of poor urban populations. And they are kind of invisible without power. And then there's the invisible with power. And those things are kind of meeting and headbutting. And you can see why some of those systems change and why they don't, because of who has the different kinds of power in the system.
One thing that has always struck me, and coming from South Africa and Colombia, which has sort of shared inequality, historical inequality and current inequality, is how these sort of food systems that coexist in the urban. It's low. Can you talk a little bit about those systems for low income versus high income consumers as well?
Yeah. So I mean, I think in South Africa, across Africa, and in here, we see a set of relationships between large-scale formal actors, so things like the supermarkets and the supply chains that feed them, and these smaller-scale informal actors who have a huge diversity. So we can't just talk about the informal sector because it's massively diverse. But what we see is, although they're treated very differently in the policy space, the consumers use them interchangeably for different reasons at different times. And so people themselves treat this as all as one part of one food system. So at the start of the month when you get paid, you go and buy big at the supermarket, then you buy the smaller, more culturally appropriate foods by the informal vendors. When you run out of money, you get food on credit from them. And so people use these systems strategically. And so my sense is that trying to maintain diversity is really important for food security, and it gives resilience because each of those systems is vulnerable in different ways to different kinds of shocks. So I think maintaining that diversity and trying to think about them as part of the same system is really important. And yet we see in the policy space, different departments are in charge of different things, and those don't come into conversation. So how do we create this kind of holistic, this one single understanding of a food system that's meeting the needs of urban populations?
I'm also curious, it's not part of the script, but I'm curious, where do you see the future of informal, like the powerless informal actors in the food systems?
Yeah, I think without concerted effort, they're going to get crowded out more and more. And whoever controls the narrative of what is good for the food system is going to come ahead. So I think there is this push towards formalization and towards the kind of marginalization of that section. But I think increasingly, and I think things like the HLPU report, but the work of the Food Environments Group here, etc., are showing that this sector is vibrant, that it is important, and that by creating an enabling environment for that sector, it can actually deliver on food security, on food system transformation incredibly effectively. So I think the more that kind of comes to the fore, the more chance there is that the state might become more welcoming.
Thank you, Jane, for that wonderful insights. And we're very excited. We're going to take you to the Kali markets and the neighborhoods so you can get a sense. And we hope to continue our collaborations as well.
Excellent. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yep.